The wind was a blade, honed on the jagged peaks of the unforgiving range and driven into the heart of the valley. It found every gap in Alara's worn coat, every thin patch in her resolve, and sliced through to the bone. Each gust was a jeering voice from Blackwood, the town that had spat her out like a sour seed. They had called her a burden, a ghost haunting the memory of her husband, Thomas. His death in the collapsed silver mine had been the town's tragedy for a week. Her continued existence was an inconvenience. The company man, Barlow, with his ledger-thin lips and coyote eyes, had produced a book of debts she never knew existed. The house was gone. The charity of neighbors, already stretched thin by a hard winter, had snapped. Now there was only the mountain, a gray tombstone against a bruised sky, and the child turning restlessly within her. The weight of her pregnancy was a constant, heavy anchor, pulling her down into the snow that was already beginning to drift past her ankles. Her feet were numb things, distant and disobedient. Despair was no longer a sharp pang of grief, but a dull, pervasive cold that had seeped into her very marrow. She could smell the pine, sharp and clean, a scent of life in a world that felt determined to see her die. She could feel the hard, irregular rhythm of the baby's kicks against her ribs, a desperate drumming from within. This life, this innocent, was the only stake she had left in the world, and she was failing it with every faltering step. The world had shrunk to the swirling vortex of snow around her, the burn in her lungs, and the terrifying, silent indifference of the wilderness. She stumbled, her hands plunging into the freezing powder, the shock of it a distant, unimportant pain. This is where it ends, she thought, not with a cry, but with a quiet surrender to the cold. The thought brought no panic, only a profound, hollow weariness. Her vision blurred, the dark trunks of the pines bleeding into the encroaching twilight. A final, shuddering breath escaped her lips, a small white cloud swallowed instantly by the storm. She awoke to the sensation of warmth, a feeling so alien it was initially painful. It was a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to be pulling her back from a great and silent distance. Her eyelids were heavy, crusted with sleep, and it took a monumental effort to pry them open. The first thing she saw was fire. It danced and leaped in a hearth of rough-hewn stone, casting flickering, distorted shadows across a low-beamed ceiling of dark wood. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something else, something savory and rich that made her stomach clench with a hunger so sharp it felt like a wound. She was lying on a pallet of furs, a coarse but clean wool blanket tucked tightly around her. Her own clothes, damp and frozen stiff when she fell, were draped over a crude wooden rack near the fire, steaming gently. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to cut through the fog in her mind. Where was she? Who had brought her here? She pushed herself up on one elbow, her body screaming in protest. Every muscle ached with a profound cellular exhaustion. The cabin was small, a single room. A rough table and 2 stools stood in the center. Shelves holding dried herbs, tins, and bundled furs lined one wall. And in the corner, his back to her, stood a man. He was enormous, a silhouette of broad shoulders and solid muscle that seemed to take up a significant portion of the small space. He wore buckskin and his dark hair was long, tied back with a leather thong. He was tending to a pot over the fire, the source of the tantalizing smell. As if sensing her movement, he turned. Alara's breath caught in her throat. His face was a landscape of hardship, dominated by a thick, untrimmed beard and a long, jagged scar that cut from his left temple down across his cheekbone, disappearing into the bristle. His eyes, set deep beneath a heavy brow, were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, and they regarded her with an unnerving, unreadable stillness. He was the mountain man, the recluse the townspeople spoke of in hushed, fearful tones. A savage, some said. A man who had turned his back on the world. He held a wooden bowl in one hand and a ladle in the other. He took a step toward her, his movements deliberate and silent. Alara shrank back against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. He stopped, several feet away, seeming to understand her fear. He placed the bowl on the floor and slid it slowly across the wooden planks until it was within her reach. Then he retreated to the far side of the cabin, sitting on a stool with his back to her, granting her the illusion of privacy. The bowl was filled with a thick, steaming broth, rich with meat and wild vegetables. The warmth of it seeped into her cold hands. She looked from the life-giving stew to the formidable, silent back of the man who had offered it. He had saved her from the snow, brought her into his home, and fed her. Yet no word had passed between them. His silence was as vast and intimidating as the mountain he inhabited, and she did not know if she had been rescued or merely captured. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world outside the cabin's single small window buried in a pristine, blinding whiteness. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the man's quiet movements. Elara had slept a deep, dreamless sleep, the likes of which she hadn't known since before Thomas's death. The broth had settled the frantic hunger in her belly, and a measure of strength had returned to her limbs. She sat up, the furs pooling around her, and watched him. He was sharpening a large hunting knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound. He moved with an economy of motion, a purposefulness that spoke of a life stripped down to its barest essentials: survival, shelter, sustenance. She saw the state of the cabin with clearer eyes now. It was not dirty, but it was neglected. A film of dust lay on the shelves, the floor needed sweeping, and a pile of buckskin clothes in the corner looked stiff and in need of mending. Last night he had eaten from the pot with a spoon, a simple, functional act. There was no sense of home here, only of a place to exist, place to be alone. Her own hands, though still raw from the cold, itched for work. It was all she had ever known. Keeping a home was a skill, a source of pride, and now, perhaps, a currency. She could not be a charity case, another mouth to feed without purpose. The shame of it was a bitter taste in her mouth. She swung her legs off the pallet, her bare feet meeting the cold wood of the floor. She stood, a little unsteady, and her worn dress hung loosely on her frame, except for the pronounced swell of her belly. The man stopped his work, his hands stilling on the knife. He watched her, his expression impassive. She drew a breath, her voice raspy from disuse. "I can earn my keep," she said. The words came out stronger than she expected. He did not respond, his gray eyes fixed on her. She gestured toward the pot, then mimed the act of cooking, of stirring. She pointed to the pile of clothes, then made a sewing motion with her fingers. "I can cook, clean, mend your things." She looked him directly in the eye, trying to convey a resolve she barely felt. "Until the baby comes. I won't be a burden." A long moment stretched between them, thick with the unspoken questions of her past and his. He looked from her face to her swollen abdomen, and for a fleeting instant, something shifted in his gaze. Not pity, but a flicker of an emotion she could not name. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned back to his knife, the rhythmic scraping resuming its steady beat. That was it. The bargain was struck. No further words were needed. A profound sense of relief washed over Elara, so potent it almost made her knees buckle. She had a purpose again. She had a place, however temporary, however strange. She looked around the rough-hewn room, at the dancing fire and the silent, scarred man who had granted her this reprieve. It was not a home, not yet, but for the first time in months it felt like a beginning. The days bled into one another, marked not by a calendar but by the rising and setting of the sun over the snow-drowned peaks. A quiet, unspoken rhythm established itself within the small cabin. Silas. She had heard a trapper call him that once, long ago in the town's general store, would rise before dawn, his large frame moving with a surprising stealth that rarely disturbed her sleep. He would leave with his rifle and his traps, melting into the vast, white wilderness, and return in the evening, often with a rabbit, a brace of grouse, or, on one occasion, the haunch of a deer slung over his shoulder. His arrivals were always silent. He would simply appear at the door, a figure stark against the blue twilight, stamping the snow from his boots before entering the warmth she had cultivated. And the warmth was hers. Elara had claimed the domestic sphere as her own kingdom. She swept the floor until the planks shone, scrubbed the small table, and brought order to the chaotic shelves. She found his neglected sewing kit, a simple roll of leather containing a few thick needles and sinew thread, and set about mending the tears in his buckskins, her stitches small and neat. But her true domain was the hearth. She learned the temperament of the fire, how to bank the coals at night so that a few breaths in the morning would bring them back to life. She experimented with the dried herbs on the shelves, discovering which ones lent a savory depth to a stew and which made a soothing tea. The food she prepared was simple, dictated by what Silas provided, but it was nourishing and flavorful. She baked a dense, heavy bread on a hot stone at the edge of the fire, and the scent of it filled the cabin, a scent of home and civilization that seemed to push back against the wildness just outside the door. Silas never commented on the changes. He never praised her cooking or remarked on the newfound order of the cabin. But she saw it in the way he would sometimes pause after a meal, the empty wooden bowl held in his hands, a look of quiet contemplation on his face. She saw it in the way he no longer flinched when she handed him a mended shirt, his calloused fingers brushing hers for the briefest of moments. The silence between them remained, a vast and deep ocean, but it was no longer a frightening one. It became a shared space, a comfortable quiet built on mutual respect and necessity. She began to observe the small details of his existence. He was not the savage of town gossip. She saw the way he would carefully reset a trap to avoid injuring an animal unnecessarily, his large hands surprisingly deft. One afternoon, he brought in a small finch, its wing clearly broken. He spent nearly an hour crafting a minuscule splint from a twig and a strip of linen, his brow furrowed in concentration. He placed the tiny, frightened creature in a box near the fire, leaving it a small dish of water and crushed seeds. In these quiet, unguarded moments, Elara caught glimpses of a gentleness he kept carefully hidden, buried deep beneath the scars and the silence. She continued her own private ritual, the one habit she had carried with her from her old life. Each night, before sleep, she would pull out the small, smooth wooden cross her mother had given her as a girl. Clutching it in her palm, she would whisper her prayers, her words a silent stream of hopes for her child and pleas for strength. She prayed for Thomas, for his soul to find peace. She prayed in gratitude for the simple fact of her survival. She knew Silas saw her. Sometimes, from the corner of her eye, she would see him pause in his task of cleaning his rifle or oiling his boots, his gaze resting on her bowed head. He never spoke of it. He never questioned. He simply watched, his face a mask of stone, and then turned back to his work, leaving her to her faith in the quiet heart of his wilderness. The seasons began their slow, inexorable turn. Patches of dark, damp earth appeared on the sun-facing slopes, and the relentless grip of the snow began to soften. One evening, Silas returned later than usual. He carried no game, and as he stepped into the firelight, Elara saw a dark stain spreading across the sleeve of his buckskin shirt. He moved with a stiffness she had not seen before, his face pale beneath his beard. He went to the water basin and began to awkwardly fumble with his sleeve, hissing in a sharp breath of pain. "Let me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She was by his side in an instant, her earlier fear of him a distant memory, replaced by a pressing concern. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his body tensing as if expecting a blow. Then he relented, allowing her to help. She gently rolled up the thick sleeve, revealing a deep, ragged gash on his forearm, oozing blood. It looked like a claw mark, but wider, angrier. "A trap," he grunted, the word a low rumble in his chest. "An old one. Rusted. He had been disabling it," she understood, "not caught in it." She nodded, her hands already moving with purpose. She fetched clean water, a strip of linen from her mending basket, and the small jar of pungent salve she had seen him use on the rescued bird. As she began to clean the wound, her touch gentle but efficient, he stood unnaturally still, his massive frame rigid. To get a better angle, she had to move behind him, reaching around his torso to tend to his arm. It was then, as she worked by the flickering light of the fire, that she saw them. The back of his shirt was old and worn thin in places. Through the softened buckskin, and where the garment shifted with his breathing, she could see the landscape of his skin beneath. It was a roadmap of old violence. A series of thick, raised welts, long-heeled but starkly white against his tanned skin, crisscrossed his back from shoulder to waist. They were whip marks, unmistakable. The sight stole the air from her lungs. This was not the random scarring of a hard life in the wilderness. This was methodical, deliberate cruelty. This was the work of another man. Suddenly, his silence was not just a preference. It was a fortress. His isolation was not a choice made in anger at the world, but perhaps a desperate flight from its brutality. The townspeople called him a savage, a wild man, but the marks on his back told a different story. They spoke of a time when he had been powerless, caged, and broken. He flinched as her fingers, momentarily stilled by shock, brushed against one of the scars. She immediately returned her focus to the fresh wound on his arm, her movements becoming even more gentle, more careful. A wave of empathy, so powerful it felt like grief, washed over her. They were both refugees, she realized, both running from a world that had tried to destroy them. She had fled from judgment and poverty. He had fled from something far, far worse. She finished dressing the wound, tying the linen bandage with a neat knot. "It will need to be kept clean," she murmured, her voice thick with an emotion she could not show. He gave a curt nod, pulling his sleeve down. He did not turn to face her. He did not offer an explanation, and she did not ask for one. The shared silence that fell between them now was deeper, heavier, and yet, somehow, more intimate than ever before. She had seen behind his shield, and the knowledge of the pain he carried settled in her heart like a smooth, heavy stone. A week later, the mountain unleashed its fury. The thaw had been a false promise, a cruel trick of early spring. A late-season blizzard descended from the peaks with a sudden violent rage, swallowing the world in a churning chaos of wind and snow. The wind howled around the small cabin, a mournful, shrieking chorus that seemed to claw at the very logs of the walls. The sturdy structure, which had once felt like a fortress, now seemed a fragile vessel in a tempestuous sea. Snow drove against the single window pane with such force it sounded like handfuls of thrown gravel. Alara sat by the hearth, her hands resting protectively on her swollen belly, a cold dread coiling within her. The storm was a visceral reminder of the night she had nearly perished, a roaring echo of her own mortality. But now the fear was not for herself. It was a primal, suffocating terror for the unborn child, the innocent life that depended entirely on her. What if the roof gave way? What if the fire went out? What if the storm trapped them for weeks, their meager supplies dwindling to nothing? The anxieties, once a low hum in the back of her mind, swelled into a deafening roar, drowning out the sound of the wind. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. Her hands trembled. Without thinking, she reached for the small wooden cross that was always in her pocket. Her fingers wrapped around the smooth, familiar shape, and the words of prayer came to her lips, unbidden. This time they were not silent whispers. They were audible, her voice a fragile thread of sound against the gale. "Dear Lord," she began, her voice trembling, "watch over this child. Keep him safe from the storm. Grant him a life, a chance. Please. He is all I have." She spoke of her fears, her hopes, her desperate plea for a future for her son. The words poured out of her, a raw, unfiltered confession to the fire and the storm and the God she wasn't even sure was listening anymore. Across the room, Silas had been reinforcing the door with a heavy wooden bar. He stopped, his body going still. He turned slowly, his face shrouded in the deep shadows cast by the fire. He watched her, his expression unreadable as always, but his attention was absolute. He did not mock. He did not look away. He simply stood there, a silent, looming sentinel, and listened as she laid her soul bare. When her prayer faltered, ending in a choked sob, she opened her tear-filled eyes to find him still watching her. The silence that followed was profound, deeper than the storm's roar. He walked over to the hearth, his heavy boots making no sound on the floorboards. He knelt and added a large log to the fire, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up the chimney. He tended to it for a long moment, his focus entirely on the flames. Then, without looking at her, he spoke. His voice was a low, rough sound, like stones grinding together. "The cabin is strong," he said. "It will hold." It wasn't a platitude. It wasn't a spiritual comfort. It was a statement of fact from a man who knew the strength of the logs he had felled, the integrity of the joints he had carved. It was his form of reassurance, a prayer of practicality and provision. In that moment, his simple, earthly words were more comforting to Alara than any heavenly promise. They were an anchor in the storm, a solid reality to cling to. She nodded, wiping the tears from her cheeks, and offered him a small, watery smile. He had heard her fear, and in his own way he had answered. The blizzard raged for 3 days, imprisoning them in their small haven of warmth and light. When it finally broke, the world was transformed, buried under a deep, silent blanket of fresh snow that glittered with an almost painful brilliance under the returning sun. The cabin's supplies, however, were running low. The flour sack was nearly empty, the salt was gone, and the coffee grounds had been reused to their absolute limit. Silas knew he had to make the journey to the settlement, a small, grimy outpost of civilization several hours' trek down the mountain. He was visibly reluctant to go. His gaze kept drifting to Alara, to the heavy swell of her abdomen beneath her dress. The baby was due soon. They both knew it. The thought of leaving her alone, even for a day, etched new lines of concern onto his already weathered face. On the morning of his departure, he packed a small rucksack with a few pelts to trade. Before he turned to leave, he walked over to the wall where his tools hung. He took down the smaller of his 2 hunting knives, not the massive one he carried at his hip, but a more practical blade with a handle of polished antler. The steel was dark and keenly sharpened. He held it out to her, handle first. Alara looked from the knife to his face, confused. "For protection," he said, his voice low. He pushed it gently into her hand. Her fingers closed around the surprisingly heavy weight of it. "You know how to use it." It was not a question. It was a statement of faith, an acknowledgement of the strength he saw in her, a strength she was only just beginning to recognize in herself. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He gave a final, searching look around the cabin, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer, and then he was gone, the heavy door closing behind him with a quiet thud. The silence he left behind was different. It was an empty, waiting silence, filled with a nervous tension. Alara tried to keep busy, kneading the last of the flour into a small, dense loaf of bread. But her ears were constantly strained, listening for any sound beyond the drip of melting snow from the eaves. Late in the afternoon, she heard it. Not the familiar, steady tread of Silas's return, but the jingle of harnesses and the impatient stomp of several horses. Her heart leaped into her throat. She rushed to the small window, peering through a crack in the wooden shutter. 3 riders were making their way up the final approach to the cabin. At their head was a man whose face was seared into her memory. Mr. Barlow, the mine owner, his fleshy face red from the cold and exertion. Flanking him were 2 hard-faced men she recognized as his foremen. Barlow's gaze was fixed on the cabin, a look of smug, predatory curiosity on his face. He had heard the rumors, then, a woman living with the mountain man. He had come to investigate, to assert his authority even here, in a place he did not own. A cold, sharp fear pierced her, but it was immediately followed by a surge of white-hot anger. This man, who had taken her home, her security, her good name, he would not take this last refuge from her. He would not threaten her child. Her hand tightened on the antler handle of the knife Silas had given her. It felt solid, real, an extension of the fierce, protective fire that now burned away her fear. She was no longer the broken widow who had stumbled out of Blackwood. The mountain, and the silent man who belonged to it had changed her. She moved away from the window and stood in the center of the room, her back to the fire, and waited. The sound of the horses stopped directly outside. A moment later, a heavy fist hammered on the door. "I know you're in there, girlie," Barlow's voice boomed through the thick wood, oily and confident. "Open up. We know the savage ain't here." Elara's knuckles were white where she gripped the knife. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her stance was firm. The fire at her back seemed to fuel her resolve. She remained silent, listening. Another, more impatient bang on the door. "Don't make me kick it down. I come a long way. Just want to talk." His definition of talk had always involved threats and ruin. She would not give him the satisfaction. A heavy thud shook the entire doorframe as one of the men threw his shoulder against it. The wooden bar Silas had set in place held firm. A string of curses followed from outside. "Fine!" Barlow shouted, his voice tight with fury. "Stay in there with your bastard child. But when you're starving, you'll come crawling. Everything on this mountain answers to me, one way or another." The threat hung in the air, venomous and chilling. He was talking about her baby. A primal rage, fierce and absolute, surged through Elara. This was not about her anymore. This was about the life she carried. She took a step toward the door, the knife held ready, a desperate plan forming in her mind to surprise them, to fight. But before she could take another step, a new sound cut through the tense silence. It was the sound of a single, heavy footstep in the snow behind the riders. Barlow and his men heard it too. They turned as one. Silas stood there, not 10 feet away. He had approached with the silence of a hunting cat, his rifle held loosely in one hand. His rucksack of supplies was on the ground behind him. His face, framed by the stark white snow, was a mask of cold, lethal fury. His eyes, usually the color of a winter sky, were now the flat, hard gray of sharpened steel. They were fixed on Barlow. "She is under my protection," Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it carried an absolute authority that cut through the cold air. It was the voice of the mountain itself, ancient and unforgiving. Barlow, though clearly startled, puffed out his chest. "This is no concern of yours, savage. This woman is a debtor from my town. This is my land," Silas stated, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Your town has no laws here." He took a slow, deliberate step forward. One of Barlow's men, emboldened by their numbers, reached for the pistol at his belt. Silas moved with a speed that was terrifying. He closed the distance in 2 long strides, the butt of his rifle swinging in a short, brutal arc that connected with the man's wrist. A sharp crack echoed in the clearing, followed by a cry of pain as the pistol fell into the snow. The second man, seeing the cold, efficient violence, raised his hands in surrender, his face pale. Silas never took his eyes off Barlow. "This mountain does not belong to you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "Leave, and do not return." Barlow, for all his bluster, was a coward at heart. He looked at the implacable figure before him, at the promise of swift and final retribution in Silas's eyes, and he saw a force he could not bully or buy. He saw a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Without another word, he scrambled onto his horse, hauling his injured man up behind him. The 3 of them galloped away, their retreat clumsy and panicked, leaving a trail of churned snow and broken pride. Silas stood motionless until the sound of their horses faded completely. Only then did he turn toward the cabin. He looked at the door, behind which he knew she was standing, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. The danger was gone. The immediate violence had passed, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more profound than before. Elara leaned against the inside of the door, her legs trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. She heard Silas outside, the soft crunch of his boots in the snow as he retrieved his rucksack, the quiet thump as he checked the integrity of the door his body had just defended. When he finally entered, the small cabin seemed to shrink around his presence. He said nothing of Barlow, nothing of the fight. He simply placed the new sack of flour and the precious parcel of salt on the table, his actions speaking a language of provision and continuity. Life would go on. They were safe. But the confrontation had broken something open between them. The carefully constructed walls of their separate silences had been breached. Later, as dusk painted the snow-covered peaks in hues of lavender and rose, a different kind of crisis began. It started as a low, persistent ache in Alara's back, a feeling she initially dismissed as weariness. But the ache grew, tightening into a rhythm, a deep, primal clenching that stole her breath. She braced herself against the table, a soft gasp escaping her lips. Silas, who was cleaning his rifle by the fire, looked up instantly, his senses attuned to her every sound. He saw the look on her face, the sweat beading on her brow despite the cool air. All the hardness, all the lethal capability he had shown just hours before vanished. In its place was a raw, naked panic. His eyes widened, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked utterly lost. He had faced down blizzards, bears, and armed men, but this force of nature, unfolding within the sanctuary of his own home, terrified him. "It's time," Alara said, her voice strained but steady. She had prepared for this moment in her mind 1,000 times. "I need a hot water." And the clean linens, her calm instructions, seemed to anchor him. The fear in his eyes was replaced by a desperate need to be useful. He sprang into action, moving with a clumsy urgency, his large hands fumbling with the kettle, stoking the fire until it roared. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and effort, a primal dance of creation. The world shrank to the confines of the cabin, to the flickering firelight, the scent of boiling herbs, and the steady, reassuring presence of the mountain man. He followed her commands without question, his face a mask of intense concentration. He supported her when she needed to walk, his strong arm a solid anchor. He wiped her brow with a cool, damp cloth, his touch surprisingly gentle. He, who was so defined by his silence, murmured low, encouraging words, phrases that were not quite coherent but were a comforting rumble in the long, dark hours. In the deepest trough of her pain, when she felt her strength give way, she looked at him, his scarred face illuminated by the fire, and saw not a stranger, not a savage, but a partner. Then, with one final, monumental effort, a new sound filled the cabin. It was not the howl of the wind or the crackle of the fire. It was a cry, thin, reedy, but vibrantly, miraculously alive. A wave of profound, overwhelming relief washed over the room. Silas, his hands trembling, carefully wrapped the newborn in a clean linen cloth and placed the tiny, squirming bundle into Alara's waiting arms. The baby, a boy, was perfect. As she held her son, her heart overflowing with a love so fierce it ached, she looked up at Silas. His face was streaked with sweat and grime, and in his stormy eyes, she saw the reflection of the fire and something else. A profound, unguarded awe. A fragile peace settled over the cabin in the days that followed. It was a peace woven from the soft, fluttering breaths of the newborn, the steady crackle of the hearth, and the quiet, shared rhythm of their new existence. Alara healed, her strength slowly returning. She spent most of her hours by the fire, holding her son, whom she had named Thomas after his father. She would study his tiny, perfect features, his little hands that curled so tightly around her finger, and feel a sense of wholeness she had thought was lost to her forever. The grief for her husband was still there, a tender ache in her heart, but it was no longer a desolate emptiness. It was now part of a larger story, a story that included this new, miraculous life. Silas had transformed. The intimidating, silent recluse had become a quiet, watchful guardian. He moved about the cabin with a newfound gentleness, his heavy footfalls softened for fear of waking the baby. He would return from his hunting trips and his first glance would not be to the fire or the food, but to the small bundle in Alara's arms. One afternoon, she watched as he sat near the hearth, a small block of pine in one hand and his knife in the other. His large, calloused fingers, which she had seen handle a rifle with deadly efficiency and help deliver her child with surprising tenderness, were now working with painstaking concentration. Shavings of wood fell to the floor as a shape began to emerge. A small bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. He worked for hours, sanding it smooth with a piece of rough leather until it felt like polished stone. He presented it to her without a word, a simple, hand-carved gift for the boy. Elara took it, her heart swelling with an emotion for which she had no name. It was more than gratitude, more than friendship. It was a deep, resonant connection forged in the crucible of shared hardship and quiet grace. That evening, as the fire burned low and baby Thomas slept soundly in a makeshift cradle Silas had built, she looked at the man sitting across from her. He was staring into the flames, his scarred face thoughtful, the harsh lines softened by the warm light. She saw him not as the town saw him, a monster or a myth, but as she knew him, a man who had been deeply wounded by the world and had sought refuge in solitude, only to find his solitude interrupted. A man who had sheltered a desperate woman and, in doing so, had found something he had not even known he was missing. He looked up, his gaze meeting hers across the silent room. "You should pray," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. The words surprised her. He had never once spoken of her faith. For the boy, she smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "Will you join me?" she asked softly. The question hung in the air between them. For him, it was a step across a chasm, an invitation back into a world of human connection he had long since abandoned. He looked at her, at the open, honest warmth in her expression. He looked at the sleeping child, a symbol of impossible new beginnings. After a long moment of hesitation, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. He moved from his stool and knelt awkwardly on the floor beside her, his large frame unaccustomed to the posture of supplication. He bowed his head, his long hair falling forward, and closed his eyes. Elara began to speak, her voice soft but clear in the quiet cabin. It was a prayer of thanks. She did not pray to a distant, abstract deity, but to the spirit of the place that had saved her. She gave thanks for the strength of the mountain, for the warmth of the fire, for the precious life sleeping in the cradle. And she gave thanks for the quiet, scarred man who had become her shelter, her protector, her home. Silas did not know the words. He had forgotten them long ago, if he ever knew them at all. But he knelt in the flickering firelight, and he listened. And for the first time in a lifetime of lonely silence, he did not feel alone.